Hello, welcome to Avalon Priestess TV with me, Demels of Box from Rockstar Priestess, and today we're talking about fairy goddesses of Celtic lands. So what is a fairy goddess? A fairy goddess is usually within the Celtic, and by Celtic today I'm meaning British Isles, so that's Britain, which is Wales, England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, and Irish. So we're talking about the British Isles. Within the British Isles, a fairy goddess is often thought to be an ancient pagan god that has been recategorized is a better word, as a fairy. And they're often recategorized as a fairy king or queen, so their divine qualities are completely taken away. And of course, the British Isles are not the only places to have fairy gods and queens and kings. We get fairy gods and kings and queens all the way across the world, from India to Indonesia to Nigeria. So they're everywhere. Fairy isn't just a British Isles thing. And why were these fairy gods and goddesses demoted and recategorized? Well, in the British Isles at least, I believe it's because when the Christian faith came in and that Christian way of thought came in, there were some gods and goddesses that they could shift and turn into saints and assimilate into their religion, which is what a lot of Christianity did at the beginning, assimilating other religions and the pagan religions of the native lands into their own philosophy and spirituality to make the transition easier for everyone. Yeah, just like the Romans did. Oh, you worship Sulis, she's just like Minerva, Sulis Minerva, we're the same team. Yeah. So there was that piece, but as much as they could canonize, for example, the goddess Bridget as a saint, there were many gods and goddesses within the British Isles that held values that were too opposite to the Christian ethos. And by opposite, I mean fairy gods and goddesses really do hold this extremely sexy, fecund, often death and battle, often the underworld, often this very close link between the realms of death and a very not human way of being. They are nature gods and goddesses. They are gods and goddesses tied in with that feminine essence of the Celtic otherworld. And that Celtic otherworld is very much about magic, and with magic and intuition and reverence of the feminine and of the earth. And these earthy gods and goddesses who were sexy, who had this like big, alive, sexy, tingly energy about them, they did not fit in this Christian system. So they were taken from being gods and goddesses and demoted, or I prefer to say recategorized, because in the Celtic otherworld, fairy and fairy gods and goddesses, fairy queens and kings, the lines between nature and the divine aren't as clear cut. And this is the thing about this invading Christian culture. For that world, the divine is a transcendence of nature. The divine is something that you have to escape nature, to escape the sexiness and escape the fecundity and escape the rawness and the wildness and the horror and the not humanness. You have to escape that to reach the divine in the Christian way of thinking, or the olden day Christian way of thinking. And for these gods and goddesses, that's what they were the god of. They don't fit. Their divinity doesn't fit into the Christian one of divinity. So they get recategorized from god to fairy, from a holy being to a simple fairy trickster thing. Yeah. So, can't turn them into a living saint, pop them as a fairy. And of course, when things become fairies, fairies receive this gradual demonization so that they become not good. They become bad. They become the servants of the devil and Satan's little handmaidens and that kind of thing. Yeah. So I believe that's where fairy kings and queens come from. They are really ancient goddesses who were always fairy kings and queens. It's not like they were goddesses and then suddenly, oh no, now they're fairies, they don't mean as much. No, they always were this, but they became only this. Because their essence and their kind of divinity did not fit into this transcendence of nature. Because the Celtic otherworld and this Celtic frame of looking at gods and this pagan way of looking at gods isn't a transcendence of nature, it's a deepening into. Yeah, it's a surrender into the great mother of nature rather than I've got to get out of this. It's a bit dirty and a bit sexy. I've got to get beyond that. Yeah, it's very different. So let's talk about some different fairy gods and goddesses so we can see this transition between goddess to fairy. And I'm going to start with Gwyn ap Nuth. And Gwyn ap Nuth is a fairy king. And he is a deity who is very, very localized. He is a deity of place of Glastonbury and Glastonbury Tor. And in ancient times, Glastonbury and Glastonbury Tor in Somerset in England was known as an Isle of the Dead. It was a sacred island, and it was for a very, 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 very long time. And it even persists now. We think of it as like a magical, sacred, holy place. And Gwyn ap Nuth is the god of the other world. He is a god of death. He is the leader of the wild hunt, and he is said to be seen in the night sky as what we call now the constellation Orion, because at certain times of the year it seems like Gwyn ap Nuth, the constellation Orion, rises out of the Tor, which is his home, to make his way across the skies with his wild hunt. Yeah, pretty cool. So he was actually quite a big deal a long time ago. He was a god. He was a god of the wildwood and a god of the underworld and a god of that place in between. But he got turned into a fairy. Why is that? Well, because he's a bit intense, right? And he was a big deal. And he always was associated with the fairy kingdom, or what in the ancient Celtic world would be more Celtic otherworld. Otherworld, fairy world, kind of the same in my opinion. So he became a fairy king that not many people know about now. Very specifically associated with a very particular place. And he was demonized by the Christian culture in the medieval times and onwards as a kind of demonic Hades, because fairies are bad and you don't want to die and have to hang out with fairies forever. Oh no, what a terrible thing, partying forever in the undead worlds. Oh no. But that's one example of a fairy king who had a very big influence pre-Christian times, but an influence that wasn't deemed holy in this big shift. Yeah, and it's not like he was a great god and then he got demoted to fairy. He was always fairy. Yeah. Another really good one that's very interesting is Queen Maeve. And she's an Irish queen. She's an Irish fairy goddess and queen. And she was thought to be a real person. And here's this really interesting thing about fairy kings and queens. They shift in and out of many things. Some of them are legends, some of them are stories, some of them are gods, some of them are real people, like Morgan Le Fay. Was she a legend? Was she a goddess? Was she a real person? We don't know. I think she was all of them. So Queen Maeve was a legendary queen of Connaught in Ireland, and she was a warrior. She was intoxicatingly beautiful. She was smart, she was clever, she was fabulous, yeah? She was very sexy. And there are all these stories about how Queen Maeve was sexually insatiable, and every night of battle she'd have sex with like 100 men and still want to keep going. That kind of vibe, yeah? You're not gonna get that adored as a saint within the Christian church. Oh no. So Queen Maeve became the great queen of the fairies. And her name was shapeshifted and changed within British Isles and British culture. So she became Queen Mab, who became very famous as the queen in Midsummer Night's Dream, immortalized by Shakespeare. And when we're talking about Shakespeare, something that I feel is very interesting is how Diana, the goddess of the Roman pantheon, the Roman virgin goddess of the woods and of hunting and the moon, she became a fairy. So if you read old Arthurian tales from the British Isles or from France, Germany, and Italy, all those lands, Diana is often mentioned, and she's often mentioned in a lot of fairy stories about otherworldly beings and magical women and enchantresses, and she gets mentioned a lot. And she is mentioned as a fairy queen, Diana, the fairy queen of the moon. And there are many places in Europe in these stories that are mentioned as Diana's forest or Diana's lake. And this is really interesting because Diana really definitely, we have lots of legit info and temples and all sorts that she was a pagan goddess. We don't really have that for a lot of the Celtic gods and goddesses because they did not worship their deities in the way that the Romans did. They didn't build big stone temples. It wasn't their thing. And so we have this goddess Diana who is seen as a queen of the fairies. Why? Why would they keep and demote or recategorize Diana as a queen of the fairies? Well, this is my belief and this is what I think. I think that these deities and these particular energies persist. Whether or not they are kind of in the approved holy canon of the current churchy situation, that inspiration persists. You can't pretend that sexiness doesn't exist. You can't pretend that the mythical magicalness of the moon doesn't exist, yeah? So with Diana, she was this big, powerful, inspiring force. And even though the culture shifted from Roman times and that pagan mythology world to Christian times, the stories of the ancient Romans and the ancient Greeks were such a big staple within Western culture for thousands of years. So even now they're such a big part of our culture. And in the medieval times they were a big part of cultured culture, yeah. And I feel like that with Diana, this inspiration, this essence, this energy was so magical and inspiring, they wanted to keep her. They didn't want to get rid of her. You can't get rid of this essence of magic because it's always there, right? You can't pretend something doesn't exist. So rather than staying as a goddess, she became a fairy queen. That became a way for her to stay within culture. That became a way for her to stay within this strange poetic realm of devotion without being deemed as holy, but still having that edge, yeah. So Diana became a fairy queen, and she is known as mother to many other fairies, and to be the one who holds lakes where knights and heroes come out of, and all that kind of thing, all the good fairy stuff. So there we have a very clear example of how a very famous pagan goddess became, within a Christianized society, within a medieval society, within a Renaissance society, within the Shakespearean world, and even in a Victorian world, became a fairy queen. It doesn't mean she's lost her magic. It's just we're looking at it in a different way, and the culture is just pretending that it's not divine when it is. And of course, another fabulous fairy queen would be Morgan Le Fay, who again is a goddess of the underworld, a goddess of death, a goddess of magic and sexuality, who didn't fit as a good, divine, holy, Christian approved lady because she's a bit too sexy and she talks about death too much and she has too much magic, yeah? So she became a fairy queen, whereas of course she was always a fairy queen because she was an otherworld goddess, yeah. And of course her name means Morgan the Fairy, Morgan Le Fay, and that Le Fay suffix think it is, that in medieval worlds was added to show that someone was magical, not necessarily that they were a fairy, but it works for us, Morgan Le Fay. And she's of course my favourite fairy queen, and I have loads of cool stuff about her. So if you'd love to learn more about this particular fairy queen, I'd love to invite you to get your hands on my free gift, which is the Morgan Le Fay Priestess activation, which has a fabulous illustrated grimoire all about Morgan Le Fay. It has a beautiful Avalonian activation audio, so then you can really deepen into meditation with this Avalon energy, and it has a fabulous autumn equinox ritual to really bring you back into your connection with your magic and enchant your life again. So if you'd love to learn more about Morgan Le Fay as a fairy queen, you can pop the link below and get your Morgan Le Fay Priestess activation. I hope you've learned a lot about fairy queens and fairy goddesses today. I love this topic. I could just read about it and talk about it forever. And I'm wishing you all the best. See you soon. Bye.